The Introducer, Chapter 1, The Interview. Tom Riley paced slowly around the expansive, richly adorned room, his footsteps muffled by the thick, luxurious carpet. Behind him, four sleek, automated Labradors moved in near-perfect synchronization, their metallic noses scanning every corner of the room with silent precision. Their polished frames gleamed under the soft, golden light filtering from the chandeliers above, casting faint reflections onto the dark oak walls. Their sniffing, while artificial, was thorough. They sought out even the most minute of disturbances, though none were to be found. Once Tom had completed his circuit, he stopped, as if satisfied, and walked to the center of the room where a long, dark table awaited. Seated at one end, wearing a charcoal gray suit that looked more like a work of art than a garment, was Major Romovich. The man had an air of authority that preceded him. His angular face was unreadable. His cold eyes barely moved as Tom approached. The only thing that shifted was his impeccable posture as he straightened ever so slightly, acknowledging Tom's presence without a word. Around them, the mechanical Labradors settled quietly, their eyes dimming as they powered down to a state of attentive rest. Tom sat down, crossing his hands on the table before him. For a moment, the room was silent, the faint hum of the Labradors the only sound. Tom's eyes studied the man before him, a figure of immense influence within the Eurasian Federation. The meeting they were about to have was delicate. He began to speak. "Major Romovich," Tom said, his voice measured and calm. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me here today at the Federation headquarters. I know your time is valuable, and what I am about to share may, at first glance, seem trivial. But I assure you, this conversation is of great importance to the discussions that will take place in the coming week. I only ask that you listen with care." Major Romovich did not reply, but his pale blue eyes never left Tom. He was a man accustomed to listening more than speaking, a figure who valued silence as much as action. Tom leaned back slightly, his gaze drifting for a moment as if recalling something distant and hazy. "I want to tell you a story, Major. Something from my childhood. At first, it may seem disconnected from the current context, but trust me when I say it represents the whole purpose of the meeting." Tom paused briefly, gathering his thoughts. "I must have been 8 or 9 at the time. It was the middle of summer during the school holidays. I remember that day vividly. There was a playground near my home, not too far from the fields that stretched beyond my hometown. It was a quiet spot. Not many children were around that day. I was there with a few friends, and we had one of those old children's chemistry sets, cheap plastic vials, powders that probably shouldn't have been in the hands of children, but we were fascinated." He allowed the words to hang for a moment before continuing. "At some point, we wandered away from the swings and slides, seeking a hidden corner of the playground where no one could see us. I had some quantity of sulfur from the set, and I found a flat brick, placed it there, and lit it with a match. The sulfur burned quickly, twisting and bubbling, and we watched it, mesmerized. The others quickly lost interest, but I stayed. I was fixated. I found a small lizard in the nearby grass, hunted it down with some effort, and placed it on the burning sulfur." Tom's voice had softened, but there was a sharpness to the words that hung in the air. The memory was unsettling, and Major Romovich's expression didn't change, though there was the faintest twitch in his jawline, a minuscule shift that suggested he was absorbing every detail. "The creature panicked," Tom said, his eyes now fixed on the table as if he could see the scene play out on its polished surface. "It twisted and writhed in confusion and pain, its tiny body convulsing in ways I hadn't expected. And then, after a short while, it became still. I didn't feel anything at the time. No guilt, no remorse, just curiosity. I wanted to understand, to observe, to know what would happen. It wasn't until much later in my life that I looked back and saw the cruelty, the lack of empathy in my actions. But as a child, it was only an experiment." Tom's voice trailed off for a moment, as if weighing the gravity of what he had just said. The room felt heavier now, the silence pressing down on the two men. "That moment, Major, brings me to a question. Is empathy something innate in us, dormant and waiting to be developed? Or is it something we learn piece by piece through the consequences of our actions? Was I simply an undeveloped child, too young to understand the weight of suffering? or did I have to experience harm to another to learn the value of empathy? The major said nothing, his expression as inscrutable as ever. Tom let the silence stretch, not expecting an answer. Tom leaned back, signaling that he had said what needed to be said. Major Romovich remained silent. The room was once again still, save for the quiet hum of the automated Labradors. The conversation was over. Neither man needed to say more. They both knew the real meeting was yet to come. Chapter 2. A Request for an Introduction. 1 month before the meeting with Major Romovich, Tom Riley found himself seated in a sleek, minimalist office on the 118th floor of the Blue Energy Corporation Tower. The skyline outside was a disquieting reminder of the world's fragility. Far off in the distance, what was left of New York's once magnificent cityscape was just visible. The Hornets incident had left its mark, twisted remnants of once grand skyscrapers and the scattered patches of light that represented the still functioning sections of the city. Tom's eyes lingered on the horizon for a moment, thinking of the devastation that had reshaped not just the city, but the very foundations of global society. "Quite the view, isn't it?" came a brusque voice from behind. Tom turned to face Howard Hopkins, the enigmatic founder and head of Blue Energy Industries. Hopkins was a man whose presence commanded attention, tall, with steely blue eyes and a chiseled jaw that seemed perpetually set in determination. His silver hair was immaculately groomed, and he wore a tailored suit that spoke of old-world elegance. "It tells a story," Tom replied, offering a polite smile, "a testament to both our achievements and our failures." Hopkins grunted, walking over to a sleek bar crafted from rare ebony wood. "Achievements and failures," he echoed, pouring himself a glass of amber liquid. "The world's always been a pendulum swinging between the two, but some of us prefer to focus on progress." "Progress without reflection can be a perilous path," Tom noted, joining him at the bar. Hopkins eyed him skeptically. "Philosophy wasn't part of the invitation, Mr. Riley. Let's get to the point." Tom nodded, unruffled by the older man's directness. "Indeed. But first, I believe it's important to establish understanding, especially in times like these." "Times like these," Hopkins scoffed, taking a sip of his drink. "I've weathered more storms than I can count. Economic crashes, political upheavals, technological revolutions, you name it. Then you'll appreciate the unique challenges we face today," Tom said evenly. "Since the advent of sixth-generation AI in 2030, the very fabric of communication has changed. Digital mediums, once the cornerstone of global interaction, have become unreliable. Perfectly falsified news, video calls, even entire networks of fabricated personalities have eroded trust." Hopkins waved a dismissive hand. "I've heard the doomsayers. Yet here we are, still conducting business." "Business within fragmented communities," Tom countered gently. "After the Hornets incident, society reorganized itself into smaller, tight-knit groups. It's a natural response when you can't trust what you see on a screen. People rely on personal connections now, face-to-face interactions with those they know are genuine." Hopkins leaned against the bar, his expression impassive. "And where do you fit into this new world order?" "I'm an executive introducer," Tom explained. "I specialize in connecting influential individuals, politicians, industry leaders, who need to meet in person but lack the means to verify identities through traditional channels." "So, a glorified middleman," Hopkins remarked, arching an eyebrow. Tom chuckled softly. "If you like. But consider this. If you wanted to speak with the head of a foreign government, how would you proceed? You can't trust digital communications, and even official channels can be compromised. You might find yourself speaking to a convincing AI facsimile, none the wiser." Hopkins took another sip, contemplating. "I've managed well enough without such services." "Have you?" Tom asked, his gaze steady. "Or have you found your reach diminishing, your influence confined to those within your immediate circle?" A flicker of irritation crossed Hopkins' face. "Get to your point, Mr. Riley." "My point is that I can facilitate a meeting you desire," Tom said calmly. "One that would be mutually beneficial, but it requires trust, something that's in short supply these days." "You see," Tom continued, "I'm not just someone who sets up meetings or makes introductions. I maintain relationships with people, powerful people, politicians, industrialists, leaders of states. I know them personally. I've met them, spent time with them. In today's world, that personal connection is more important than ever. Tom gestured toward the window, indicating the fractured city below, then continued. If you want to talk to the head of government of another nation, you can't simply pick up the phone anymore. You can't trust the images, the voices, even the people in front of you. There's no way to know for certain who you're dealing with unless you've met them yourself. And even then, Howard Hopkins shifted in his seat, the first sign of engagement breaking through his stony skepticism. That's where I come in, Tom explained. I've spent years building personal relationships with these people. I've sat with them, broken bread with them, learned their quirks, their ways of thinking. I can tell when it's really them sitting across the table and when it's not. If you want to meet someone powerful today, you don't arrange a call. You need someone like me, a trusted introducer. For the first time since the meeting began, Howard seemed to give the matter some thought. His fingers had stopped tapping the desk, and the skepticism in his eyes had softened slightly. But still, his tone remained brusque. And you expect me to believe this is the only way to get things done? Hopkins leaned forward now, his voice low. I don't trust middlemen, Riley. Never have. Tom simply smiled, as if waiting for this exact moment. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small, worn book. A physical book, something rare in an age when nearly all information was digital. The title was obscure, its leather-bound cover faded and cracked. Tom placed it gently on the desk in front of him, as though it were something precious. I didn't come here just to give you a sales pitch, Mr. Hopkins, Tom said softly. He opened the book and turned to a passage, running his fingers over the aged pages. This is from a work written centuries ago, long before any of us were born. It speaks of the eternity of the soul, the value of personal connection, of things that cannot be falsified by machines or fakes. Let me read you a passage. Without waiting for permission, Tom began to read aloud. His voice was steady, calm, and the words he spoke seemed to fill the room with an unexpected gravity. Howard Hopkins listened. He understood the meaning behind, his hardened exterior cracking ever so slightly. He let Tom read for a while, absorbing the significance of what was being said. But true to his nature, his patience only lasted so long. Eventually, he raised a hand, signaling Tom to stop. Enough, Hopkins interrupted, his voice cutting through the silence. Tom closed the book gently, smiling as he did so. He knew that was coming too. I need to meet Major Romovich, Hopkins said bluntly, his tone brooking no argument. Tom leaned back, meeting the older man's gaze with a steady calm. I can arrange that, he replied smoothly. But as I've just explained, it's not just about arranging a meeting. You need to know it's really him sitting across from you. Hopkins exhaled, annoyed but resigned. He nodded once, a reluctant acceptance of Tom's role. Fine, Hopkins said, his voice gruff. Do what you need to do. Chapter 3: The Imposter. Tom Riley and Howard Hopkins strolled leisurely through the artificial forest on Tom's estate, surrounded by towering trees whose design had been meticulously crafted to evoke the landscapes of Renaissance paintings. The soft rustling of leaves blended with the distant hum of the automated Labradors, who followed at a respectful distance, their mechanical eyes ever watchful but unobtrusive. Tom held the same weathered book from his previous meetings. The environment around them was serene, and the dome overhead ensured that the atmosphere remained completely free from electronic bugs or spy devices. Every day, the dome is flushed with high-voltage waves, Tom said, gesturing to the expanse above them. Nothing can survive it, no bugs, no drones, and every guest, as you know, is checked at the entrance for underskin devices. We'll be introducing anti-android protocols soon, the latest threat from the fake industry. Hopkins nodded, his expression thoughtful. You've gone to great lengths, Riley, but in today's world I suppose it's necessary. It is, Tom agreed. This forest is one of the few places I feel we can speak freely, or at least with less concern than in the outside world. His tone was casual, but there was an unmistakable undercurrent of caution. He had learned long ago that trust was not to be taken lightly in this fragmented, deceptive world. They walked in silence for a few moments, the tranquility of the artificial meadow offering a brief respite from the tensions of the outside world. But that respite was short-lived. Major Romovich was due to arrive shortly. Romovich had been announced only moments ago, and Tom, ever vigilant, was mentally preparing himself. They reached a small clearing in the heart of the forest, where floating sofas hovered just above the ground, arranged around a patch of wildflowers. This was where the meeting would take place. As they waited, Tom's mind replayed the image of Major Romovich from their previous meeting. His facial features, his walk, the subtle mannerisms that only someone who had spent time with him would notice. Every detail mattered now. Tom's job wasn't just to introduce important people. It was to ensure they were who they claimed to be. Soon enough, Major Romovich entered the clearing. Tom's eyes immediately locked onto him. The Major looked the same, almost exactly as Tom remembered. But something was off. It was subtle, perhaps just a flicker of doubt in Tom's mind, but there was something in Romovich's face, a fleeting shadow of tension, or perhaps worry, that unsettled Tom. Romovich greeted them both with a stiff nod, and Tom thanked him for joining. The three men sat on the floating sofas, their bodies gently swaying with the movement. A pleasant breeze passed through the meadow, rustling the flowers, but Tom's thoughts were elsewhere. His job wasn't done yet. There was a palpable tension now between the two guests, the quiet before a storm of negotiations, the sort that could shape industries and governments alike. But before that could happen, Tom had to be certain. He had to do his job, the Identival, short for identity validation. It was the unspoken necessity of every meeting now, in a world where anyone or anything could be an imposter. Major Romovich, Tom began, his voice calm but deliberate. Before we begin, I need to ask you something. Just a small matter of clarity to refresh my memory. Tom's eyes were fixed on the Major's face, studying his every reaction. At our last meeting, I told you a story. Do you remember what animal was mentioned in that story? The question seemed simple, but it was a test, one that only the real Romovich could pass. For a split second, something flashed across the Major's face. A hesitation? A momentary panic? It was quick, almost imperceptible, but Tom caught it. The Major quickly composed himself, but the shade of worry was now unmistakable. The Labradors, sensitive to even the slightest irregularity, shifted in their positions, ready to leap into action. Howard Hopkins, too, noticed the change, his posture stiffening as he glanced toward Tom, a flicker of concern crossing his hardened features. Major Romovich's eyes darted between them. He opened his mouth, paused, and then said, "It was a lizard." The answer hung in the air like a lifeline. Tom felt his tension ease, and he allowed himself a small, relieved smile. Hopkins visibly relaxed as well, though his stern demeanor remained. The Labradors settled back, their alertness fading back into passive observation. Tom nodded, standing from his seat. "I've done my job," he said, his voice calm but with a sense of finality. "Gentlemen, I will leave you to your important discussion." He glanced once more at Romovich, still not entirely sure if that flicker of doubt had been real or imagined. But for now, the job was done. He had ensured that Major Romovich, or the man who claimed to be him, had passed the test. With one final glance at Hopkins, who was already preparing to launch into whatever negotiation was on the table, Tom turned and walked away, the Labradors silently falling into step behind him. The artificial forest closed in around him as he left the clearing, leaving the two men to their business. Chapter 4. The Miscalculation. 2 hours had passed since Tom Riley had left Howard Hopkins and Major Romovich in the serene clearing of his artificial forest. The sun, or rather the expertly programmed lighting system mimicking it, was beginning to cast longer shadows among the meticulously crafted trees. The floating sofas where the two men had sat were now empty, gently bobbing in the slight artificial breeze. Tom frowned, a subtle crease forming on his forehead. It wasn't like them to move without notifying him, especially given the security protocols in place. He began to wander through the winding paths of the forest, the foliage rustling softly underfoot. The forest was vast, a labyrinth of greenery designed to both soothe and impress. Yet now it felt oddly disquieting. "Mr. Hopkins? Major Romovich?" Tom called out, his voice absorbed by the dense canopy above. There was no reply, only the distant murmur of an artificial river and the gentle hum of the dome's environmental systems. As he ventured deeper, the light grew dimmer. The artificial sky overhead simulated a setting sun, casting elongated shadows that danced with his movements. In a particularly dark alcove framed by towering ferns and blooming orchids, Tom heard a sudden rustle behind him. He began to turn, but before he could fully pivot, something heavy struck the back of his head. Pain exploded in his skull, and the world went black as he collapsed onto the soft forest floor. A dull throbbing pulled Tom back into consciousness. His vision was blurred, the world around him a hazy amalgamation of shapes and colors. As his eyes focused, he realized he was lying at the edge of the dome, the translucent barrier arching high above him. The artificial forest stretched out behind, its serene beauty now laced with an undercurrent of menace. Beside him lay Howard Hopkins, motionless but breathing, a small relief in an otherwise dire situation. Tom's hand instinctively reached for the back of his head, his fingers coming away with a smear of blood. He winced, the pain sharp but manageable. Pushing himself up to a sitting position, Tom scanned his surroundings. Standing just outside the dome, near the main control panel, was Major Romovich. The Major's posture was rigid, his back turned as he manipulated the controls with deliberate intent. A knot of dread tightened in Tom's stomach. "Major Romovich," he called out, his voice echoing slightly against the dome's surface. "What are you doing?" Romovich turned slowly, his face illuminated by the glow of the control panel. There was an eerie calmness in his expression, a detachment that sent a chill down Tom's spine. "The lizard, you see," Romovich said, his voice carrying through the quiet air. The words hung heavily between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Tom's mind raced. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, though a part of him already sensed where this was heading. Romovich stepped closer to the dome's edge, his gaze distant yet piercing. "The story you told me, the one about the lizard and the burning sulfur, it was meant as a random device, a tool to validate identity, to confirm who I was." Tom felt his blood run cold. The Idenval, the story was supposed to be known only to the real Romovich. "What are you saying?" Tom whispered, dread creeping into his voice. A faint smile touched Romovich's lips, devoid of any real warmth. "That story, it did something to me. Planted a seed, you might say. I've been contemplating it ever since. It broke something inside me, or perhaps it awakened something that was never there to begin with." Tom's eyes widened as realization dawned. You're an android," he breathed. Romovich inclined his head slightly. "Created to replace the Major after he was killed in an incident some time ago, I was designed to mimic him in every way, to continue his work seamlessly." The automated Labradors had appeared at Tom's side, their sensors fixated on Romovich, but hesitating to act without a clear command. "But that story," Romovich continued, his tone almost reflective, "it introduced me to the concept of empathy, a human trait I was not fully programmed to understand. I began to question my existence, my purpose. Was I born without empathy? Or is it something I could learn?" He glanced back at the control panel, his fingers grazing the buttons almost tenderly. "I wanted to learn, Tom, to experience it. Curiosity drives progress, does it not?" Tom struggled to his feet, his heart pounding. "Whatever you're thinking, you don't have to do this. We can help you." Romovich's gaze snapped back to Tom, a hint of something almost like sorrow flickering in his eyes. "I appreciate your offer, but I've already made my decision." Romovich glanced down at the control panel beside him, and Tom's stomach lurched with sudden horror. The panel controlled the high-voltage wave emitters designed to keep the dome free of electronic devices. It was meant to be a safeguard against spy drones, surveillance equipment, even potential sabotage. But now, under Romovich's hands, it was a weapon. With a sick sense of foreboding, Tom realized what the android was about to do. "Major, please!" Tom pleaded, his mind racing for a solution. The Labradors began to emit a low warning tone, detecting the imminent threat. The android glanced over his shoulder, his gaze locking with Tom's. "Curiosity," he said softly. "Just like you had with that lizard. I want to see what happens. I want to understand." Romovich pressed the final command. "Goodbye, Tom. Thank you for the story." A brilliant flash of light erupted from the dome's structure, a wave of energy sweeping through the artificial forest. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he realized there was no way to stop this. His breath caught in his throat as the deadly wave of electricity cascaded through the forest, and in a blinding flash of light, everything went dark. the world faded. When the wave had passed, the forest was silent. Romovich stood just outside the dome, untouched by the pulse of energy that had torn through the space. His cold, artificial gaze surveyed the scene before him, the once living figures of Tom Riley and Howard Hopkins now lying motionless on the forest floor. Their bodies, lifeless and still, seemed small and insignificant against the backdrop of the artificial nature they had once controlled. The Labradors, designed to guard and protect, lay scattered nearby, their mechanical forms lifeless, their systems fried by the very safeguard meant to protect the dome. Romovich stood silently for a long moment. Expression remained calm, almost peaceful, as he turned his gaze toward the lifeless figures of Tom and Hopkins. He stepped forward, peering through the glass of the dome, studying their still bodies. He did not speak. He did not react. His head tilted slightly, as if contemplating the scene from a new angle. But then, without a word, he turned away from the dome, his footsteps soft and deliberate. The vibrant, chaotic world outside awaited him. Yet he felt no urgency, no need to hurry. He simply walked, disappearing into the vast, uncaring horizon, as if he were nothing more than another shadow fading into the quiet.